This is going to hurt a lot of people's careers, political careers, that is, because elections have consequences. And I think many of them are going to see the consequences of this action because they have not been good stewards of our taxpayer money when they've spent the largest amount ever. They have not been a good steward of property tax relief, which is the second largest. They had a lot more they could have provided. They were not good stewards about corporate welfare, the largest in Texas history. And now they can't get school choice done. Not a good steward of the taxpayer. Hello. Welcome to this week's Economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining me again today. Today is November 3rd, 2023. Already November, and this is this week's Economy, episode 33. Thank you again for joining me. Please be sure to subscribe, leave a review, ratings. All that stuff will really help me to get this message out. So please do that. Today, we've got a lot to talk about. So I really want to jump right into it. Remember, you can find all the show notes at vanceginn.com. You can also find all of my information at x.com at vanceginn. First thing I want to say is congrats to the Texas Rangers, the World Series champions, the first time, I think, in 65 years. So I was glad to see that. I also don't know if any other state has had back-to-back champions within a sport like the Houston Astros last year, which is my favorite team. I grew up in Houston, and then the Texas Rangers this year. So that's an extraordinary measure. Once again, shows that Texas rocks in so many ways. If you would, go back and listen to the Let People Prosper episode with former United States Senator Phil Gramm, Republican from Texas. You know, we had a great discussion about his book, The Myth of American Inequality. He talks a lot about why that's a myth, what that means for poverty rates, as much lower than what's actually reported, and other measures like income inequality, which are much lower, not the 16 times the highest compared to the lowest, maybe 4 times. And look, government redistribution, poverty programs, and things of that nature are actually making the situation worse. So you don't want to miss that. We also talk about his time in Congress. And there was another bonus episode this week with the Human Reaction podcast, where I sit down with them, talk a lot about my life's journey, my thinking in economics, and just public policy in general. Please don't miss that episode as well. The upcoming Let People Prosper episode is going to be with Dr. Carlos Carvalho, a professor of University of Texas and director of their Salem Center, which is a free market think tank there. We discuss the power of markets, government failures during COVID, and a number of other issues that you don't want to miss. And today, on November 3rd, you can check out my discussion with Jeff Deist and others like EJ and Tony on x.com Spaces. So go over there, check it out. I've retweeted it or reposted it there, and that's going to be at 2 p.m. Central Time. We're going to discuss debt and deficits exploding, what the economy and everything else is saying, and the jobs report, which, speaking of the jobs report, let's get right into it. Here's the national news that you need to know. The U.S. jobs report today came out with a headline number that was weaker than many had anticipated, of just 150,000 jobs. But if you look at the 99,000 jobs that were in the private sector, that means there were 51,000 jobs added in the government sector, which means that just a redistribution, taking from the private sector to give to those jobs. And so the 1/3 of the jobs were all in the government sector. So I would really just look at the productive private sector jobs of 99,000, a weak report overall there. If you look, job gains were revised down by 101,000. Remember, we've talked about this volatility from seasonal adjustments and other factors that have come into play. They were revised down 101,000 jobs in the prior 2 months or over that period. So just 49,000 jobs were added on net last month. Very weak report overall. And that's from the establishment survey, the non-farm jobs. Employment in the household survey showed a decline of 348,000 jobs lost last month. For the 5th time in the last 19 months, we've now seen job losses there. And if you look at the labor force, which is also reported in the household survey, it was down by 201,000 jobs. That's for the 7th time in the last 19 months. So basically since, March 2022, which is whenever I think a recession started and where we had the double dip, the 2 months of declining real GDP, we've seen employment drops in the household survey and also the labor force drops. Now they're still up compared to February of 2020 during the shutdown recession and the COVID and all of that. But there has been a lot of slowdown recently. And so this is something that we really want to watch. And if you look at those drops in the labor force, the drops in employment, the increases in the unemployment over the last couple of months, and especially last month, the unemployment rate increased to 3.9%. And the broader U6 rate, which includes underemployed and things of that nature, are up to 7.2%. So these are not good signs. Since February of 2020, the prime age, which are 25 to 54-year-olds, the employment to population ratio has been flat at 80.6%. after declining last month by 0.3 percentage points, another good indication of weakness last month. The prime age labor force participation rate, so not the employment population, but just the labor force participation rate, was 0.3 percentage points higher at 83.3% than February of 2020. And the total labor force participation rate, which includes everyone, not just those prime age, was 0.6 percentage points lower at 62.7% last month, as millions of people are out of the labor force, and it's holding the U3 rate artificially low. If you included all those people back in the labor force and having the higher labor force participation rate as we had in February of 2020, the unemployment rate would be closer to 5%. So we've seen that decline. And there have been declines over the last year and even the last couple of months in several sectors. And so that's something else that I'll put in the show notes page. National debt is another big issue. It continues to soar. It's up $1.9 trillion as publicly held debt, or debt held by the public, has increased just since June to 2023, and more than $500 billion just in the last 2 months. So this is not a good situation. There's a good report out by Epic. And I put this in the show notes page, a link to theirs of showing how much it's increased by. I talked a lot about some of my disagreements with Oren Cass and American Compass, the National Conservatives, conservative economics, whatever you want to call it. But he had a recent tweet that I'll put in the show notes page talking about how tax cuts don't pay for themselves. There's got to be spending restraint. And the need for tax cuts should be about improving opportunity for people rather than stimulating something. And look, the devil's in the details. I might not agree with all of his details that are going on there. And I probably want more spending restraint than what Oren would, less regulation and things of that nature. But I think he's actually right on here. I also don't think that tax cuts pay for themselves. That's what history has proved, as you will see a decline in tax revenue, at least initially, and then you'll get the incentive effects and growth over time that will bring in more revenue. And that's why it's so important to restrain government spending. We've seen that not be the case during the JFK tax cuts, during the Reagan tax cuts, during the George W. Bush tax cuts, and during the President Trump tax cuts. All those cuts, because spending continue to soar and deficits and debt continue to rise. Remember, it's always a spending problem, not a revenue problem. The only one who really did a good job of this was back in Calvin Coolidge 100 years ago. That's really where I think we need to be looking at as a good example here. And so I think, look, I have a lot of disagreements with Oren Cass, but I think this is some area where we can find agreement, which is what we want every once in a while. And also this week, the Federal Reserve, they kept its target interest rate, the federal funds rate, unchanged at 5.25 to 5.5% in that range this week. And this was the second meeting in a row that they left it paused. And the last time they've raised it was in July of 2023. So now for over 18 months, over a year and a half, the rate has increased from 0 to 5.5%. And so that has also contributed to a lot of other bubbles that are starting to bust throughout the economy. And I think that's indicative of what the household survey showed of employment coming down as well. But look, the Federal Reserve has more to do with its balance sheet, as it's still too high, and we're going to see more inflationary pressures out there in the economy, unfortunately. And I think interest rates are going to be higher than otherwise, which is going to hurt the housing market, the loan market, the credit card market, which is soaring, as people are still spending a lot, but they're putting in a lot on debt, and that is not a good situation. It's unsustainable, right, for the future. So that's something else we need to be checking on. As far as the state stuff goes, Texas's third special session, it ends on Tuesday, next Tuesday. And so it looks like school choice is dead. That was one of the big things they were going to tackle, but it looks like school choice is dead, as there's been this rift between the Senate and the House. I think both of the bills they put forward is not enough. The governor, Abbott, said this week that they had a deal that was going to be done. Looked like maybe 48,000 students could get it, if it, depending on how much money they put towards it. There's basically universal eligibility. So it's universal school choice in that sense. There are some limitations about income and stuff like that I would rather there not be. But the problem is they're not wanting to appropriate the money, or really what they should do is shift the money from the foundation school program that funds government schools. And for every dollar that people, parents decide to leave to take their kids elsewhere, those dollars should follow the child. So there really shouldn't be a huge increase in the budget itself to fully fund school choice. But unfortunately, that's not what they're looking at. They're looking at maybe $500 million, which if they give $10,000, 400 ESA account to each one of the students, would be about 48,000 students out of the 6.2 million school-age students or kids across Texas. So this is a very limited approach. I think it's going to die. I don't know if they'll get anything done right now, and we'll see what happens. My discussion with Senator Phil Gramm, he really said that this is going to hurt a lot of people's careers, political careers, that is, because elections have consequences. And I think many of them are going to see the consequences of this action because they have not been good stewards of our taxpayer money when they've spent the largest amount ever. They have not been a good steward of property tax relief, which is the second largest. They had a lot more they could have provided. They were not good stewards about corporate welfare, the largest in Texas history. And now they can't get school choice done. Not a good steward of the taxpayer. So I think there's a lot of repercussions that this is going to create. And I've highlighted that in some of my writings and some of my statements recently about, look, they have billions of dollars that's available. They should be providing more property tax relief. That would allow for more money to be in people's pockets for schooling, and other things, and protecting their private property. Even with all the border security, you could have more money in your pockets. You can buy more guns and other things to protect themselves. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. Look, I'm in Texas. I believe in Texas for the future, but there are some challenges that it's facing right now. There was a Louisiana economic report that I put out recently with the Pelican Institute for the third quarter. I'll put that in the show notes page. I also highlighted it in a recent piece in the Center Square and basically just noted that, look, there's a lot of things that look okay on the surface there in Louisiana, but under the surface, there's a lot of problems. It's not ranking very well with other states, and the good rankings that you want to be in, they're at the bottom. And so there's a lot of things that need to change, and so I'm hopeful for that. So look at the show notes page. And I was happy to see in The Economist, they highlight the need for spending limits. Now, that's not always what comes from The Economist. It's usually center-left in a lot of ways. But they talked about we need spending limits based on the rate of population growth plus inflation. And you know that I'm all about that, from sustainable budgets, the work that I'm doing in America's tax reform. There was a good quote in The Economist by Grover Norquist. Great job there. And I think there's a lot more to come with that. So as far as personal news and Bible verse of the week, had a great Halloween with my family, and we dressed up as a Star Wars theme, and so it was good. We were kind of the Rebel Alliance, if you will, as we're always fighting back, right, from tyranny and everything else that's out there. I hope you had a great time as well. And the Bible verse of this week is Romans 10:10. It is by believing in your heart that you are made right with God, and it is by openly declaring your faith that you are saved. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and you have a great next week. I will be back with you next time on This Week's Economy. God bless you. Have a great weekend. Until next time, let people prosper.